No one noticed her at first. A uniformed female cop lay bleeding on a rain-soaked street, written off as another casualty of the city's endless violence. Sirens were far away. Witnesses looked away. Then a black convoy stopped. The man who stepped out wasn't a rescuer. He was the most feared Mafia boss in the city. What he saw in her body made him freeze. One symbol, one detail. Something the police themselves had buried years ago. Instead of finishing her, he did the unthinkable. He protected her. Within days, hospitals were locked down. Police records vanished, and senior officers panicked behind closed doors. Because if she survived, an entire department would fall. Stay till the end. What happened next exposed a truth so dark that the police force never recovered. The city had learned to survive by pretending not to see. Its streets were always awake, even when the lights were off, breathing through alleyways soaked in rain, oil, and old secrets. Violence wasn't shocking anymore. It was routine. Bodies appeared, disappeared, and were quickly forgotten. News cycles moved on. So did people in this city. Morality wasn't about right or wrong. It was about power. At the top of that power structure stood one man, known publicly as a businessman and privately as a kingmaker. His name was whispered rather than spoken, not because it was unknown, but because speaking, it invited consequences. He controlled ports, construction contracts, underground gambling, and entire neighborhoods that the police only entered during daylight and never alone. To many, he was a monster. To others, a necessary evil. To himself, he was simply a man who understood how the city truly worked. He hadn't always been this way. His rise came from learning early that institutions failed first, people second. Law, order, justice, they were decorations for the weak. Survival belonged to those who adapted faster than the rules could change. Over the years, he built an empire by exploiting corruption rather than fighting it. He paid officers, silenced judges, and kept files on politicians who swore they were clean. The police force, in particular, was never an enemy. It was a tool. That was why the sight of a dying police officer on the street should have meant nothing to him. The night he found her, the city was tense. A crackdown had been announced earlier that week. A public show of strength by the department, complete with press conferences and promises of reform. The streets responded the only way they knew how, with chaos. Gang disputes flared. Anonymous tips flooded emergency lines. Patrol units were stretched thin, sent into unfamiliar territories without backup. It was a perfect storm for something to go wrong. The female officer had been part of a unit few people knew existed. She wasn't assigned to traffic stops or crowd control. Her work kept her away from cameras, from uniforms that stayed clean. She was trained for internal investigations, the kind that didn't make headlines until years later, if ever. The department liked to call it accountability. Internally, it was called containment. She had joined the force with the belief that hadn't yet been beaten out of her. Unlike most recruits, she wasn't chasing authority or stability. She was chasing answers. Her past had left her with questions that official reports never explained. Cases that were closed too quickly, names that appeared in files and then vanished. Becoming an officer wasn't a dream, it was a strategy. Her progress was slow, but deliberate. She learned which corridors to walk through, which doors to knock on, and which ones to avoid. She learned how corruption didn't announce itself loudly. It blended in, wearing badges and earning promotions. Over time, she began to notice patterns, evidence misfiled, body cameras malfunctioning at convenient moments, witnesses recanting after quiet meetings. None of it was enough on its own. Together, it painted a picture the department did not want seen. Her latest assignment was unofficial. No paperwork, no backup. She was following a trail that connected missing evidence, from old cases to current. Ranking officials. The deeper she went, the more resistance she felt. Not openly, but subtly. Calls unanswered. Requests delayed. Warnings disguised as concern. The message was clear. Stop digging. She didn't. The night she collapsed on the street, she had just left a meeting that was never logged. Whatever she learned there was dangerous enough to make someone decide she wouldn't make it home. Whether the attack was meant to kill her or scare her would never be clear. What was clear was that she was abandoned, where she fell, stripped of her weapon. Her badge still pinned to her chest, bleeding out in a part of the city where help rarely came. Ordinary citizens passed by, eyes down, steps quick. In this city, getting involved was a liability. Police cruisers were busy elsewhere. Ambulances were delayed. Her fate, statistically, was already sealed. The Mafia boss's convoy wasn't supposed to be there either. His route had changed at the last moment, redirected by instinct rather than necessity. He noticed her not because of the uniform, but because of something out of place, the way her body was positioned, deliberate rather than random. This wasn't a mugging gone wrong. It was a message. He had seen messages before. As he stood over her, memories surfaced that he hadn't revisited in years. A time when the police had sworn to protect and instead destroyed. A case long, buried, involving an officer who tried to expose corruption and paid for it with his life. That officer had worn the same insignia, now stained with blood, on the street. The realization unsettled him more than the violence itself. He understood the language of power, and this was a language he knew well. Silence the threat, control the narrative, move on. What he didn't expect was to feel the weight of choice pressing down on him. Helping her meant interference. Interference meant attention. Attention meant disruption. Something he usually avoided, unless it served him. But this wasn't business. The city was already watching, without knowing it. Surveillance cameras caught shadows. Anonymous calls were logged. Somewhere inside police headquarters, a report was delayed longer than protocol allowed. Files related to her unit were accessed after midnight by someone who shouldn't have had clearance. Small ripples began spreading outward from the moment she hit the ground. By morning, rumors circulated quietly among officers. A colleague missing. An investigation paused. A superior unusually tense. No official statement was made, but unease settled into the building like fog. The department was used to controlling damage, but this time the variables were unstable. The Mafia boss, meanwhile, began pulling information. Not from the police, from his own network, hospital staff, emergency responders, street informants. What he uncovered confirmed what his instincts already suspected. This officer had uncovered something that threatened people far more powerful than her. People who wore badges and held press briefings about justice for the first time in years. The balance between the underworld and law enforcement shifted, not because of a war, but because of a secret that refused to stay buried. The city didn't know it yet, but lines were being redrawn. Alliances tested. The question was no longer whether the officer would survive, but what would happen if she did. And who would fall when the truth finally surfaced? The city began to change in subtle ways. First, the kind that only people who lived by patterns could feel. Police patrol routes shifted without explanation. Unmarked cars lingered longer than usual outside hospitals. Internal memos circulated, with vague language about procedural reviews and temporary suspensions. none of them naming the injured officer, yet all clearly orbiting her existence. Silence became policy. Inside the hospital where she lay between life and death, security tightened quietly. Officially, it was due to a spike in gang-related violence. Unofficially, it was containment. Visitor lists were restricted. Medical staff rotated more frequently. Records were accessed, then re-accessed each time by higher-ranking credentials. The department was not waiting to see if she survived. It was preparing for damage control. If she did, the Mafia boss ensured that no one touched her without his awareness. Not through threats or overt force, but through influence that blended seamlessly into the hospital's daily rhythm. Donations were pledged. Administrative favors were called in. Certain corridors became safer than others. The staff never knew who was responsible, only that interference suddenly carried consequences. For the first time, the woman was protected not by the badge she wore, but by the fear her survival inspired. As days passed, fragments of her investigation surfaced through indirect channels. The boss's network uncovered sealed evidence logs, tied to old cases, each one involving officers who had died, resigned, or transferred shortly after filing internal complaints. Promotions traced upward in a straight line, leading to a small group of senior officials who had built their careers on clean public images and dirty private actions. These weren't isolated incidents, they were systematic. The more he learned, the clearer it became that the police department had long been running to parallel systems. One enforced the law on the streets. The other existed to protect itself at any cost. Officers who threatened that balance were neutralized quietly. Reports rewritten. Scenes altered. Careers erased. The female officer had stepped directly into that machinery and refused to stop moving. Within headquarters, paranoia spread. Supervisors questioned loyalty without asking directly. Files were moved, then deleted. An emergency ethics review was announced, more symbolic than sincere. Behind closed doors, officials argued over whether eliminating one injured officer would truly solve the problem or confirm it. The fear wasn't exposure alone, it was precedent. If one buried truth surfaced, others might follow. Rumors leaked into the media through anonymous sources. A wounded officer, possible internal misconduct. Nothing concrete, just enough to attract attention. Journalists began circling, filing information requests, pressing spokespeople for clarity. Each vague response only fed suspicion. The department had weathered scandals before, but never with this level of instability beneath the surface. Meanwhile, the woman's condition improved slowly, dangerously so. For those who wanted her silent consciousness came in fragments. Memory followed. Even without speaking, her existence was a threat. Whatever she had uncovered was likely stored somewhere beyond her body. Backups, timestamps, digital footprints. The uncertainty drove panic deeper into the ranks. The Mafia boss faced pressure of his own. His involvement had not gone unnoticed. Rival groups questioned his motives. Allies warned him that crossing the police at this level invited chaos. He had spent years maintaining equilibrium. Bribes here, favors there. Predictable corruption that kept business flowing. What he was doing now disrupted that ecosystem. Yet he continued, not out of morality, but recognition. The system he had mastered depended on corruption being controlled. What the officer uncovered wasn't controlled. It was greed, without limits, power protecting itself blindly. That kind of rot eventually collapsed structures, including those he relied on. In saving her, he wasn't challenging the system. He was correcting it. Outside the hospital, events escalated. A whistleblower within the department leaked partial documents to an oversight committee. The files were incomplete, but their existence forced an inquiry. Public pressure mounted. Protesters gathered, not in outrage yet, but curiosity, the most dangerous stage for any secret. Senior officials began distancing themselves from one another. Statements contradicted past records, timelines shifted. One internal investigator resigned abruptly, citing personal reasons. Another was placed on leave pending review. The department's unified front fractured. Replaced by the woman became a symbol without ever appearing in public. Two honest officers. She represented courage, punished. To corrupt ones, she was a liability that refused to disappear. To the public, she was a question mark the department could not erase. As the inquiry expanded, evidence surfaced connecting past cover-ups to ongoing operations. Confiscated assets that never reached evidence rooms. Arrests that targeted expendable suspects while protecting real perpetrators. Internal reports altered after submission. The narrative the department had sold for decades began unraveling thread by thread. The Mafia boss released information strategically, never all at once. Each disclosure triggered another reaction, a resignation, a suspension, a delayed press conference. The pressure built steadily, like water behind a dam. No single action was dramatic enough to cause collapse, but together they made it inevitable. By the time the woman was officially declared stable, the city was holding its breath. Police leadership scrambled to regain control, announcing reforms that rang hollow. Too many eyes were watching now. Too many questions had been asked. The stage was set for confrontation, not with guns or violence, but with exposure. The kind that stripped authority bare in public view. What began as a body left to die on the street had become a reckoning, and the people who believed themselves untouchable were running out of places to hide. The collapse did not begin with an arrest or a confession. It began with a room full of powerful people realizing they had lost control. The oversight hearing was scheduled as a formality, a public gesture meant to calm growing suspicion. It was supposed to be procedural, controlled, and forgettable. Instead, it became the moment everything unraveled. Senior police officials entered the chamber with rehearsed confidence, believing the narrative was still theirs to shape. They underestimated how deeply the truth had already spread. Evidence arrived in waves. Time-stamped, internal files appeared. On record, revealing edits made long after reports were submitted. Surveillance footage surfaced that contradicted official timelines from years earlier. Financial trails connected seized assets to shell accounts, operated through intermediaries tied to police leadership. Each revelation was methodical, undeniable, and devastating. This was no rogue officer problem. It was structural corruption, carefully engineered and fiercely protected. The female officer's investigation was no longer theoretical. It was mapped, documented, and impossible to dismiss. As the presentation continued, faces tightened. Some officials stared forward, others avoided eye contact. The body language told its own story. This was not surprise, it was recognition. They knew these files. They had signed off on them. They had believed those signatures would never resurface. Outside the chamber, media coverage exploded live. Updates spread across screens nationwide. The public watched in real time as the image of an untouchable police force cracked open. Every new detail deepened the sense of betrayal. The institution tasked with enforcing the law had quietly become its most calculated violator. Behind the scenes, the Mafia boss ensured there would be no escape. Emergency injunctions filed to block evidence were countered before they reached a judge. Attempts to discredit sources collapsed under verification. Backup copies of files appeared in multiple jurisdictions. The safeguards he put in place transformed exposure into inevitability. What shocked the room most was not the volume of evidence, but its origin. It became clear that the officer had not acted alone in collecting it. Others had helped quietly. Analysts, junior officers, clerks who had seen too much and said nothing for years. Her survival had emboldened them. Fear no longer felt safer than truth. The pressure reached a breaking point when a senior official attempted to redirect blame publicly, framing the corruption as isolated misconduct. Within minutes, a new file was introduced, showing that same official authorizing the reassignment of officers who later died under suspicious circumstances. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. The attempt to control the narrative backfired spectacularly. The chamber descended into visible chaos. Order was called, ignored, and called again. Authority no longer commanded obedience, it demanded credibility. And credibility was gone. Simultaneously, warrants were executed across the city. Offices sealed, homes searched, bank accounts frozen. Officers who once operated above scrutiny found themselves subject to it. The machinery of accountability, long suppressed, roared back to life with a vengeance. This was not symbolic justice. It was operational. The female officer was not present, but her presence was everywhere. Her case file formed the backbone of the proceedings. Her methodology set the standard for verification. Her near-death was cited repeatedly as evidence of how far the department had gone to protect itself. In trying to erase her, they had elevated her beyond reach. The Mafia boss watched from a distance, invisible as always. His role remained officially unacknowledged, but its impact was unmistakable. By choosing strategy over violence, patience over intimidation, he had delivered a reckoning no weapon could have achieved. The irony was impossible to miss. The underworld had forced the law to confront itself. As the climax peaked, resignations followed arrests, statements were retracted. Careers ended in hours after decades of insulation. The police force, once unified by silence, fractured publicly along moral lines. Officers stepped forward to cooperate. Others were removed in handcuffs. Trust collapsed faster than anyone predicted. The most devastating moment came when a reconstructed timeline of the female officer's attack was presented. Surveillance gaps filled, communications traced. It showed intent, coordination, and approval at a level that shattered any remaining illusion of accident or rogue action. The attack had been authorized. That single conclusion detonated what little defense remained. Public reaction was immediate and unforgiving. Protests erupted, not in anger alone, but in disbelief. Communities that had accepted corruption as inevitable now saw proof of its scale. Confidence in the system plummeted, dragging political allies down with it. Emergency reforms were announced, but they sounded hollow against the weight of what had been revealed. By the end of the day, the police force was unrecognizable. Its leadership decimated. Its reputation in ruins. Its authority questioned at every level. What remained was a shell. Forced to rebuild under scrutiny, it could no longer evade. The climax was not loud, but it was absolute. A woman left to die on the street had become the catalyst for the largest institutional reckoning the city had ever seen. Then those who believed themselves untouchable learned the truth. Too late. Power only lasts as long as no one dares to expose it. The city did not return to normal after the reckoning. It couldn't. Too much had been exposed, and too many illusions had been stripped away. What followed was not closure, but reconstruction, slow, painful, and watched from every angle. Trust, once broken at an institutional level, did not regenerate on command. In the weeks after the hearings, the police department underwent changes that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Entire leadership tiers were removed. Temporary administrators were installed from outside the city to prevent internal influence. Oversight mechanisms, once treated as ceremonial, became permanent, their authority backed by legislation passed under public pressure. The force shrank before it could rebuild, shedding not only corruption, but complacency. Investigations continued quietly and relentlessly. Cold cases were reopened. Evidence rooms were audited. Officers who had resigned years earlier were questioned anew. Some truths surfaced, long after headlines, faded confirmations of cover-ups that families had suspected but never proven. For them, justice arrived late, but it arrived with validation. The female officer's recovery was steady, though incomplete. Physical wounds healed faster than institutional ones. She never returned to the streets in uniform. Instead, she became something more dangerous to corruption than an armed officer, a witness with documentation, experience, and credibility. Her testimony influenced reforms not just locally, but nationally, reshaping how internal investigations were conducted and protected. She declined public attention. No interviews, no book deals. Her absence from the spotlight made her presence more powerful. She became a standard rather than a celebrity, proof that integrity could survive inside a broken system, even if it nearly destroyed the person who carried it. The Mafia boss faded back into the background, his involvement never officially acknowledged. Law enforcement restructured its relationship with the underworld, not out of gratitude, but necessity. The balance of power shifted subtly. Corruption no longer operated openly, but cautiously. Systems were cleaner, not because morality prevailed, but because exposure had consequences. Again, for the first time in decades, fear changed direction. The public response evolved over time. Initial outrage gave way to sustained vigilance. Community groups formed to monitor police activity. Independent audits became expected rather than exceptional. Younger officers entered the force under a different climate, one where silence was no longer synonymous with survival. The department's image remained scarred. Rebuilding legitimacy took years, and some trust never returned. But something essential had changed. Accountability was no longer theoretical. It had precedent. The city itself absorbed the lesson in fragments. Street-level crime did not disappear. Power did not become virtuous, but the narrative shifted. People stopped assuming the worst was hidden and started demanding proof. Transparency became a currency no institution could afford to ignore. The story of the dying officer found on the street became urban legend, then case study, then history. Each retelling emphasized a different angle: betrayal, courage, irony. Few mentioned the Mafia boss. Fewer still understood how close everything came to remaining buried. The final impact was not the fall of corrupt officials, but the interruption of inevitability. The belief that nothing could change had been challenged publicly and irrevocably. One survival had triggered a chain reaction that no single authority could stop. Years later, new recruits would pass through training halls where her case was taught quietly, without heroics. It served as a warning and a promise. Systems could fail. People could choose differently. In a city built on silence, the loudest legacy was truth, and the understanding that even the most untouchable power could collapse when confronted by evidence. persistence, and the refusal to disappear.